观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎您收看华尔街多媒体外汇市场播报，我是康璐。今天是2011年12月2日，星期五，来看一下本周外汇市场的走势情况。那么本周二欧洲财长会议让市场失望，并没有任何关于欧债危机解决的细节出台，由此欧元是出现一定程度走低态势。那么本周三，中国人民银行意外宣布降低准备金率50个基点，由此美元出现了走低的态势。随后，美联储更是联合了其他5大央行宣布会降低美元互换掉期50个基点，美元走低，而风险货币对美元则是出现了全盘走高态势。目前在本周五，美国官方公布了11月份的非农就业报告，显示美国失业率降至2年半以来的最低点，美元再次出现了走强的趋势，而欧元则是转而走弱。那么再来看一下其他主要汇率当中，美元对日元目前出现一定程度的走高，涨幅目前是超过了0.3%，而目前美元对瑞士法郎也是出现一定程度的走高态势，涨幅是达到了0.6%。在本期节目当中，我们再次请到了 FXCM 的外汇策略分析师 Michael Brochus 先生来到我们的节目。Hi, Michael. Thank you for joining us again.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.
So first of all, euro hit a one-week high after the central bank's intervention. So what's your take from this collective effort, and how has that affect the currency market in a short term and in a long term?
Sure. Well, I think the effect has actually already played out. You saw that massive two-day rally, which was unprecedented on that deal to reduce swap rates. However, I think that's sort of factored in already, and the effect of that has already played out. And everyone's looking to next Friday to see what kind of deal Merkel and Sarkozy can come up with. So in the interim, although we have seen that large run up, the underlying pressure on the euro is still to the downside.
Let's see if there will be no deal for next Friday. Do you think central bank gonna put more money into this market or not?
I think they'll have to. I think they'll have no choice. And again, even a move to put further funds. There was talks today about possibly central banks donating to the IMF and funneling through that avenue 200 to 300 billion euros, which is still a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed in the case of a Spanish or an Italian default. So it's going to be interesting. It looks like they will have to add additional funds. The Eurobond conversation is kind of fallen off at this point. So again, to reiterate, a lot of pressure is looking on the euro for next Friday.
And many people argue that if there will be no deal for next Friday, maybe Eurozone will collapse. So how could the investor get prepared for some dramatic change in Europe?
Right. Well, as it stands right now, for investors who are concerned about this looming threat, staying away from the euro or building up any euro positions is probably the best position. This could go both ways. We're expecting that they possibly can come up with a foundation to lay for a decoupling mechanism. So if Eurozone countries are unable to comply with the standards that are needed for them to receive funds, they would by which they can have an option to decouple. But that raises a whole other ballgame of questions of who's next. What are the standards by which people are going to decide whether they should be decoupling or whether they should be staying? So it's going to be very tricky. On the long term, again, don't see anything really massive coming out unless there's a quote-unquote rehaul of the Eurozone project, which is really what everyone has hopes on. What kind of plans or what kind of ideas can Sarkozy and Merkel really come up with to quell market concerns which continue to mount despite this swap rate decrease, despite all these coordinated interventions. The threat still looms, and the credit crunch is really the concern that everyone's really looking at this point.
And last but not least, what kind of news stories or economic data could move this market most next week?
Sure. Well, next week's economic docket is jam-packed. So we have interest rate decisions from 5 central banks, starting with the Australian Reserve Central Bank, which is going to be on Tuesday. They're looking to cut interest rates. Another thing that's kind of gone under the radar, which I think has massive implications, is China. We're getting a lot of China CPI data next week, and also the looming crunch right there with whether inflation is going to be too high for them to continue easing. They took the first step this week in easing measures by reducing the reserve requirements by 25 basis points. That was the first easing measure they've taken in over 3 years. So just the step back into easing, complemented with all the central banks who continue to lower growth forecasts and continue to urge further easing, I think China can have a really big implication, specifically on the euro, right? Specifically on the Aussie. But then when we go back to the European problem, we're looking at the ECB interest rate decision, which they're also looking for a possible 25 basis point cut, and then the EU summit on Friday, which should really, everything will be culminating into Friday.
Can I ask one more question? Do you think China is going to keep cutting reserve ratio, or that's just one-time thing?
I think that at this point it's going to be too aggressive for them to aggressively cut because of the looming concerns about inflation. So we're going to see how the CPI print comes out. It's actually expected to decrease by a full percentage point to 4.5%. So we'll see how that pans out. But I think that's going to have a lot to do with whether China decides to continue with their easing policy.
Thank you for sharing today.
Cheers, thanks for having me.
好，感谢您收看本期的外汇市场播报，我们下周同一时间再会。